I'm prepared to do anything I can to play for my country again.
Do it then. What about your start to the game?
It wasn't bad, was it?
Why should an honest answer be a mistake?
How can a modern day manager not have a mobile phone?
Why should he?
Yeah, you're welcome along. So loads to discuss on the football show this evening. Very happy to bring in right off the top the Athletics. Sam Lee covers Manchester City in the main. A big week for Manchester City. Stamford Bridge at the weekend. It is PSG tomorrow and then Liverpool the weekend coming. Very happy to say Sam Lee with us now. Hey Sam, how you doing?
Yeah, good evening. Very well, thanks. Yeah, I was at Chelsea at the weekend, in Paris now, and I'll be at Liverpool as well, so can't complain at the minute.
The glamour of Sam Lee's life.
Yes, very much so.
So this was obviously a big game. It felt like an important game early on for Manchester City against Chelsea, Stamford Bridge. Chelsea have been so impressive so early on this season. Lukaku obviously added to last season, and it's fair to say last season they had Manchester City's number of times as well, not least in the Champions League final. So there were quite a few ingredients here as we headed into this game which kind of pointed towards a Chelsea win, certainly not a Chelsea defeat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what the result did is kind of flipped a few, I hate using the word narrative, but it is the easiest one. It kind of flipped a few narratives on the head, to be honest. It didn't look like City were going to win. I'll be honest, I thought they were going to lose. But whenever I spoke in the media, I had to be kind of rational about it and think there's no reason to be so down on them beyond the fact that they'd drawn against Southampton last weekend and Chelsea had won. It was very easy to kind of get sucked into that, Chelsea are unstoppable and City are the opposite. But ultimately, they're an excellent team with excellent players and they've got a great manager. And it should never have been a foregone conclusion. But yeah, going into it, I did a few other interviews beforehand and people weren't just saying, what if City lose against Chelsea? But I was being asked the question probably 3 or 4 times last week. What happens if they lose all 3 of these games that we've mentioned? And you just think it should never be at this scenario really, where you start thinking all of a sudden it's October and City season's a washout. They are too good for that. And yeah, the result, it's flipped that on its head. And I can't imagine within the dressing room they were too down on themselves, but certainly for us on the outside, if anybody thought City were going to be a pushover this season, they might not win the league because there's very big competition. But they're not going to give it up without a fight. They're not going to be out of it by October, certainly.
I suppose with City, it's that the early signs were slightly jittery, and even in 3 of their 7 games before Saturday, they had failed to score. So there were some warning signs, and we know obviously about their pursuit of Harry Kane. So that was the worry, that really after the brilliance of the second half of last season, they had started so indifferently. And for instance, Spurs had held them not comfortably, but not far off it as that game played out, for instance.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I think I mentioned the word rational. Do those 7 games include Leicester in the Community Shield?
I think so. Yeah, I think it was 7 games in all competitions.
Well, that means nothing to me. Inside the dressing room, I'm sure it means even less.
But 3 of 6 wasn't great for a team who were, fairly interested in Harry Kane. It just wasn't ideal.
If we're going to talk about reasons and situations and context and stuff going into a match, I mean, I completely get that. If they've got Harry Kane, would it be this and would it be that? But the Leicester game, they played Sam Adozie, who the vast majority of your listeners will never have heard of. A youngster on the left. They had guys, even the senior guys, have been back in training for 4 or 5 days. The Tottenham game, not too much better, to be honest, in terms of the fitness of the players. Raheem Sterling played, which is one of the few games he started this season, but he played without any kind of pre-season preparation whatsoever.
Yeah.
They lost the game. They weren't great, but I mean, honestly, at the time, I thought, well, they're kind of undercooked, and it's not really the kind of team you'd expect them to be playing in most games anyway. They had Ake at centre-back with Mendy, and we can't talk about Mendy, but he was horrific for their goal in particular. So the Tottenham game wasn't too much of an issue. The Leicester game, honestly, means next to nothing, I would argue. The Southampton game, obviously the week before the Chelsea game, probably conditioned people a bit, and myself included, into thinking, right, okay, if they can be caught off by, a team, let's be honest, who even since that game haven't won a game in the Premier League this season. A fairly ordinary team with a decent plan to press City, you would think, well, if that's the case, then what about Chelsea? So I appreciate that argument. But in terms of them not scoring goals in those 3 games, I think there's very good reasons for that. And it's not too much of an issue, that I would argue.
What was so striking about Saturday was that they were going up against a Chelsea side who have so many midfield options, who in Kante probably have the best midfielder of his type in the world, and that we had seen Tuchel go with the 3-man midfield in the second half against Spurs the previous weekend and just taken the game away from Spurs. I mean, just wrestled total control of the game. And so it was really kind of quite something to see. I don't know, Sam, what your sense was in the stadium, but from minute 1, with Rodri and Bernardo Silva as a bit of a platform, City just bossed the game and controlled the game and spent most of their time in Chelsea's half. It was nearly half an hour before Lukaku had any kind of meaningful impact in the final third for Chelsea. It's kind of an extraordinary level of dominance that City managed to just impose right from the off.
Oh, it was. I mean, I do have to say that, Chelsea did play into that, as you mentioned there, by picking that team. And, it's interesting, actually, I kind of raised an eyebrow when you said Kante is the best midfielder of his type, and he is. But interestingly, he was in the positions on Saturday where that type isn't what he needed to be, because of the very few occasions that Chelsea had an opportunity to kind of hit on the break or on the transition, however you want to categorise it. He was the one who had to bring the ball forward and kind of play that incisive pass, either between City's full-back and the centre-back or between the 2 centre-backs. It had to be a precise pass. And Kante is the best midfielder of his type, but that type does not really include those kind of passes. I know he's got better on the ball over the last couple of years, since Sarri, really, but still not the kind of passes you would expect Havertz to play, or possibly Mount if he were playing, or I know Ziyech hasn't been consistent since he joined, but that kind of players who you would want to carry that threat. And obviously, so they had the 3 men in midfield who, they were a formidable midfield 3, but when you got 5 behind and 2 strikers, not even anybody linking the play ahead of them, it was always going to be an issue, because City basically had 6 midfielders on the pitch. There was always, if Chelsea thought they were going to outnumber City by having 3 midfielders, they were sorely mistaken, because City just had too many. And the other part of it was, Tuchel's lineup did hamper them. And, that performance wouldn't have been that performance without Chelsea's approach. But City were fantastic. They just did not let them out, as you say. The pressing was incredibly coordinated. It was very sophisticated in terms of, they weren't just running at Chelsea players and, getting in their faces. They were running from certain angles. They were forcing them in different directions. They were holding it a bit so they didn't go long, because, if Chelsea had gone long, which they didn't want to be fair, but if they'd gone long, then it would have been an aerial duel between Diaz and Lukaku, or Laporte and Werner. They waited enough for them to play, and then they pounced. City basically did to Chelsea what Southampton had done to City a week before. And City lost the ball with Fernandinho as a defensive midfielder a lot, because as soon as the ball came into his feet, Southampton pounced on him in that kind of 4-2-2-2, where you've just got midfielders everywhere. And City did the same. Like, how good is Jorginho? He was talked up as a Ballon d'Or candidate after that performance in the final. City tried to buy Jorginho, or whenever I've seen him play, particularly whenever I've seen him play against City, I think I see exactly the player they were trying to sign. He's fantastic. But City they absolutely hunted them down in that sense. And that's why Chelsea couldn't get out. That's why Lukaku barely had any involvement. They hampered themselves, Chelsea, with the lineup they picked, but also City's game plan. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they expected Chelsea to be so negative. Maybe they didn't. But whatever reason for it, the game plan was spot on, because they just absolutely swarmed them. Although, that said, in the first half, they couldn't really create any proper chances down the middle, because what Chelsea probably did still have was 3 huge centre-backs who know exactly what they're doing against the likes of Foden, Bernardo Silva, Grealish. Not big guys at all, but obviously in the second half, it changed with that deflected goal.
Yeah. For people who didn't see the game, Sam, I'm doing a disservice here to the level of movement we saw at times from City, but in broad terms, Jesus again was maybe predominantly on the right-hand side, Grealish on the left. You would say De Bruyne was a little bit behind Foden, but to be fair, they
a little bit, but very close. Yeah, they were kind of like a front. They were kind of like 2 false nines.
They were, yeah. It was like 2 false nines. Maybe that's the new frontier. What do you make of this? Do you think this is approaching where Pep is going to go with this team and will be their best side? Like Jesus on the right-hand side still doesn't feel a natural fit to me as much as Pep is telling me he's really good out there.
Yeah, it's strange. It's almost like with the game how it panned out at least dictated that Jesus on the right-hand side was always going to work because, whenever they tried to play out from the back with Rudiger and Marcos Alonso and I think it was Kovacic over that side, they did try and play out. So Jesus making himself busy and getting about and, running in from the right angles and doing what he was told was perfect. When they play, maybe it'll work against Liverpool next week, but, when they play against somebody at home, maybe he's not exactly the right man you want on the right wing. But in fairness, he's got 2 or 3 assists to his name and more chances created this season. So it's an interesting little dynamic that, like I say, in terms of the kind of the running and the pressing and the effort, it was spot on. But it does make me wonder, did Guardiola expect them to play with that setup? Did he expect them to not have too much in terms of the transitions? And it's almost like maybe, this isn't discrediting him. I've talked about this game a lot since the final whistle, but I'm also wondering if it, kind of stumbled across it a bit because I do think, obviously, Chelsea's setup helped. And what he picked for City undoubtedly worked. But I wonder if Chelsea had played like they did in the Champions League final, for example, with a bit more adventure. I know they didn't have Mount or Pulisic, but if they'd played with a bit more adventure, I wonder if it would have worked the same way. But it did work very well. Against Liverpool in the weekend, I think it would have to be slightly different because, Van Dijk, he'll play long. They don't mind switching the ball from one flank to be fair, Chelsea do that at times, but they don't mind switching the ball from one flank to the other, I should say, from fullback to fullback. And, if they kind of press Liverpool that high up and kind of force them into it, it's not too much of a hardship for Liverpool. They will play the ball long. They know how to win the second balls. Whereas Chelsea at the weekend, they were reluctant to do that. So there will be a bit of a tweaking approach to the Liverpool game. And it's impossible to know or to predict who's going to start in those games. But if they do want some element of pressing, then I would certainly say Gabriel Jesus is your man as opposed to Mahrez, who, as an easy comparison, he started the Champions League final. And then easy to say in hindsight. But, if they had that Jesus on the right-hand side, then maybe it would have helped a bit. But, he wasn't even playing that position back then. So that is a very, throwaway line, if I'm being honest.
So PSG tomorrow should be cracking game and there's all sorts of glamour associated with it for obvious reasons. Just one other player I was curious about. Sterling came off the bench in the 87th minute. We did see him start against Spurs. Feels a long time ago now. Last season,
a long time ago, yeah.
Work out so great for him last season. So is Sterling likely to feature here? Do you suspect Pep has gone off him a touch?
Well, going back to last season to go on the going off him kind of answer. It's going back to last season, there was a bit of a row between the two, and he didn't end the season. Well, he basically, by the end of the season, Guardiola played the same 11, more or less. Rodri changed, Fernandinho changed, but the same 11 that played against, 2 legs against Borussia Dortmund, 2 legs against PSG. And there was only those two, Rodri and Fernandinho, they changed a bit, and Cancelo and Zinchenko at left back. But that was it. The front three, I'm testing my memory a bit now, but Foden on the left and Mahrez on the right, and kind of De Bruyne was a false 9, but with Bernardo Silva getting up there. Gundogan as a staple. They were kind of set in stone. And Guardiola then, he would change his team for the less important games when he was resting these guys. And in that less important team, Raheem Sterling played. So that was a kind of interesting shift in status for him. And it kind of centered around, as far as I'm concerned, a row that they'd had in March time. Obviously, he played in the Champions League final then, Sterling, which was a huge surprise to everybody. And it has to be said, it didn't really work. Then went and played for England in the summer, was probably one of England's best players, but yeah, like you say, he played against Spurs, which was almost a lifetime ago. And then, so that was the first Premier League game. I think Southampton would have been the 5th. In between that, he didn't play. He played against Southampton, didn't play great. He then played against Wickham last midweek, didn't play great even in that game against League One opposition. On a night when young players are playing well. Ferran Torres didn't play particularly well, but he scored his goal in the end. Nothing Sterling tried worked. Obviously, wasn't thought of for the Chelsea game. There was a stat reported by my colleague at the MEN. I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically, in all the games that City have played against Chelsea under Pep Guardiola, which is probably I want to say 10, maybe more. Sterling have played in all of them, but not this time. But yeah, against PSG, I think given the fact it's a long group stage, PSG drew their first game, City won theirs. The fact that there was an intense game at the weekend just gone, there will be an intense game against Liverpool coming up.
Yeah.
I think Guardiola will probably change his team around a bit. Also, you've got to keep happy your big names like Sterling and Mahrez, who are expecting to play more games than they have been.
Yeah.
So, yeah, long story short, although I've given you the long story already, it wouldn't surprise me to see Sterling on the left and Mahrez on the right.
Okay.
And a bit of a change from Guardiola.
Okay. Sam Lee from The Athletic, thanks a million. Enjoy Paris. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much, guys. A pleasure as always.
Cheers. Latest in the game between Crystal Palace and Brighton. Still 1-0 Crystal Palace after an hour. And Dundalk have scored a second against Bows. Patrick Hoban on the hour mark. They're 2-0 up.